When Lucy moved into her new apartment on Ashbury Lane, it felt like the fresh start she desperately needed. After months of upheaval in her life, the cozy one-bedroom on the third floor offered peace and privacy. The old building had charm, creaky floors, intricate woodwork, and tall windows that let in plenty of sunlight. Yet, something about the place felt off. Her neighbors seemed friendly enough. There was Mrs. Graves, a sweet elderly woman who lived downstairs, and Tim, the talkative college student across the hall. But it was the apartment next door that caught her attention. Apartment 304. She'd never seen anyone go in or out, yet faint sounds, footsteps, whispers, and once a haunting melody emanated from behind its door at odd hours. "Who lives in 304?" Lucy asked Tim one evening while grabbing her mail. Tim hesitated. "No one. Anymore. The last tenant. Well, she disappeared a year ago. Left everything behind. Creepy, huh?" Lucy laughed nervously. "Yeah, creepy." Lucy's first night in the apartment was uneventful, but the second night was different. As she lay in bed, she heard a rhythmic tapping coming from the wall she shared with 304. It was soft at first, then louder, like someone was knocking from the other side. She pressed her ear to the wall. "Hello?" she whispered, feeling ridiculous. The tapping stopped. When she stepped back, a faint voice whispered, so soft it could have been the wind. "Lucy." Her blood ran cold. She backed away and spent the rest of the night with the TV on, the volume turned up. A few days later, Lucy decided to investigate. The building's superintendent, Mr. Hargrove, was reluctant to talk about 304. "That apartment has history," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. Determined, Lucy waited until Mr. Hargrove stepped out, then slipped a credit card into 304's lock. To her surprise, the door clicked open. The apartment was dark and smelled of dust and decay. Furniture lay scattered as if someone had left in a hurry. A faint chill hung in the air. On a desk near the window, she found a leather-bound journal. Flipping through the pages, she saw frantic handwriting, detailing strange events, whispers in the night, shadows moving on their own, and dreams of drowning. The final entry made her heart race. It's not just the apartment, it's the building. It's watching, it's waiting. Don't let it take you. That night, Lucy couldn't sleep. The tapping returned, louder than before. This time, it was accompanied by a faint sobbing. Gathering her courage, she knocked back. The noise stopped. Then her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Why did you go into 304? Her heart pounded as she typed back, "Who is this?" No response. Minutes later, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a photo. A picture of her, standing in 304, taken from the doorway. The next morning, Lucy confronted Mrs. Graves. The old woman's expression darkened at the mention of 304. "You shouldn't have gone in there," Mrs. Graves said. "This building, it's not normal. It feeds on people. That's why no one stays long. You have to leave, Lucy, before it's too late." But Lucy couldn't leave. She needed answers. Returning to her apartment, she flipped through the journal again, finding a sketch of a strange symbol etched into the wall of 304. She grabbed a flashlight and headed back inside. There, in the center of the living room, she found the symbol carved into the floor. As she shone her flashlight over it, shadows began to coalesce around her, forming a figure with hollow eyes and an outstretched hand. Lucy stumbled back, her flashlight flickering. The figure advanced, its whispers filling her ears. "Leave! It hissed, "Or stay forever." Gripping the journal, she threw it at the symbol. The pages ignited, flames spreading across the floor. The figure recoiled, its form dissolving into smoke. Lucy bolted from the apartment, slamming the door behind her. The building trembled, and for a moment, she thought it might collapse. But then, everything went still. Lucy moved out the next day. As she packed her things, she noticed a new message scrawled on her wall, written in ash. "You can't run forever." She left without looking back, but she knew the building's eyes were still on her, waiting for the next tenant to arrive. Story 2. The Midnight Lake was a place shrouded in mystery. Nestled in the heart of an ancient forest, it was said to appear only under the light of a full moon. Locals spoke of its glassy surface that reflected the sky perfectly, and of the eerie silence that surrounded it. But they also whispered of those who had ventured too close and never returned. Elliot had heard the stories all his life. As a photographer, he was drawn to the challenge of capturing the legendary lake. When the full moon rose one autumn night, he packed his camera and set out on the winding trail that led into the forest. His friends had warned him not to go, but he laughed off their concerns. "It's just a lake," he said. "What's the worst that could happen?" The deeper Elliot walked into the woods, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of nocturnal animals were absent, replaced by an oppressive stillness. Even the crunch of his boots on the forest floor seemed muted. After what felt like hours, he saw it. The midnight lake stretched before him, its surface so smooth it looked like a mirror. The full moon hung above, casting an ethereal glow over the water. Elliot set up his tripod and began taking photos. As his camera clicked, he noticed something strange. The lake's surface rippled, though there was no wind. He leaned closer, peering into the water. That's when he saw it, a face staring back at him. But it wasn't his own. The face in the water was pale, its hollow eyes fixed on Elliot. It didn't move with the ripples. Instead, it seemed to hover just beneath the surface, waiting. Elliot stumbled back, nearly knocking over his camera. As he stood there, the whispers began. Faint and indistinct at first, they grew louder, forming words that echoed in his mind. "Stay with us." He grabbed his camera and turned to leave, but the trail had vanished. The forest around him was different now. The trees twisted and gnarled. The lake, once silent, began to hum with a low, vibrating sound. Elliot's flashlight flickered as he tried to find his way back. Shadows danced at the edges of his vision, flitting between the trees. He called out, hoping someone would hear him, but his voice was swallowed by the hum. When he looked back at the lake, he saw them. Figures emerged from the water, their forms barely distinguishable from the shadows. They walked slowly, their feet not disturbing the surface of the lake. Their faces were blank except for their eyes, which glowed faintly in the moonlight. One of them raised a hand and pointed at him. Panic set in as Elliot ran, the whispers growing louder with every step. He tripped and fell, his flashlight skidding away. In the darkness, the hum became deafening, and the figures drew closer. He could feel their presence, cold and suffocating, as they surrounded him. One of them knelt beside him, its face inches from his. "You came to see us," it said in a voice that was both many and one. "Now you cannot leave." Elliot tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure reached out, its hand passing through his chest. A searing cold spread through his body, and his vision blurred. When Elliot woke, the forest was silent again. The lake was calm, its surface reflecting the sky perfectly. He stumbled to his feet, his camera lying nearby. He picked it up and looked around, but the figures were gone. Relieved, he turned to the lake one last time. His reflection stared back at him, but something was wrong. The face in the water wasn't his. It was pale, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the moonlight. The whispers returned, faint but insistent, as he realized the truth. He was no longer himself. He was part of the lake now, just another reflection waiting for the next curious traveler. End of story 2. Story 3. When the Grayson family moved into the old Victorian house on Elm Street, they thought they had found their dream home. With its grand staircase, ornate molding, and spacious rooms, it was everything they had ever wanted. Sure, it needed a little work, but the price was unbeatable. "It's just old," David Grayson told his wife, Laura, as they unpacked boxes. "A place like this has character." Their son Jack wasn't so sure. The house felt cold, even on sunny days, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. On their first night, as he lay in bed, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, he thought he heard whispers coming from the walls. The whispers grew louder over the next few days. At first they were faint, like a distant breeze. But soon Jack could make out words. His name, repeated softly and insistently. "It's probably the pipes," Laura said when he told her. "Old houses make noise." But Jack wasn't convinced. One evening, while exploring the attic, he found something strange. A small wooden box tucked behind a stack of old trunks. Inside were faded photographs of a family he didn't recognize. Their eyes seemed unnaturally sharp, as if they were staring right at him. Beneath the photos was a note scrawled in shaky handwriting. "They watch from the shadows. Don't let them in." That night, the shadows in Jack's room seemed to move. He watched frozen as a dark figure detached itself from the corner and crept closer. It had no face, only a shifting, flickering outline. "Jack," it whispered, its voice like dry leaves scraping together. He bolted from his room, running straight to his parents' bedroom. "There's something in my room," he cried. David checked but found nothing. "You had a bad dream, buddy," he said. "Get some sleep." But Jack knew it wasn't a dream. The next day, Laura decided to look into the house's history. What she found was chilling. The previous owners, the Connors family, had vanished without a trace nearly 50 years ago. Before that, there had been reports of strange occurrences, unexplained noises, objects moving on their own, and sightings of shadowy figures. "It's just stories," David said when she told him. "People love to make up ghost tales about old houses." But Laura wasn't so sure. That night, she placed a camera in Jack's room, determined to prove once and for all that nothing was there. The footage was worse than she could have imagined. As Jack slept, the shadows in his room began to shift and writhe. One by one, they gathered at his bedside, their outlines flickering like dying flames. One leaned close, whispering something the camera didn't pick up. Laura showed the video to David, who went pale. "We're leaving," he said, "tonight." But as they packed, the house seemed to come alive. Doors slammed shut, windows rattled, and the whispers filled every room. The shadows stretched across the walls, blocking their path. "You can't leave," a voice boomed louder than the others. "You're ours now." Desperate, Laura remembered the note Jack had found in the attic. "Don't let them in." Grabbing a piece of chalk, she scrawled a circle around her family, hoping to create some kind of barrier. The shadows recoiled, shrieking as if in pain. The house trembled, and for a moment, it felt like the walls would collapse. Then, silence. When they opened their eyes, the shadows were gone, and the whispers had ceased. Without a word, they grabbed their bags and left the house for good. A "for sale" sign appeared in front of the house a week later. The Graysons never spoke of what happened, but they couldn't escape the feeling that the shadows were still watching, waiting for their next family to arrive. End of Story 3, Story 4. For years, the story of the ghost train of Hollow Creek had circulated among locals. It was said that every full moon, a phantom locomotive roared through the abandoned railway tracks, its whistle echoing in the dead of night. Those who saw it claimed they could hear screams mixed with the clatter of its wheels, but no one who dared to follow it ever returned. Nathan had always dismissed the story as nonsense. A journalist for the city's urban legends blog, he thrived on debunking myths. When he heard about the ghost train, he decided to spend the night at the old Hollow Creek station to prove it was just another baseless tale. With a backpack full of gear and his camera ready, Nathan set out, eager for a good story. The Hollow Creek station was a crumbling relic of the past. Vines crept up the walls, and broken windows allowed the wind to howl through the empty building. Nathan set up his equipment on the platform, the rusted tracks stretching into the darkness ahead. As the night deepened, the sounds of the forest quieted. Even the crickets stopped chirping, leaving an eerie silence. Nathan checked his watch. 11:58 p.m. According to the legend, the ghost train appeared at midnight. At exactly 12 o'clock, the air grew cold. A low rumble echoed in the distance, and a faint light appeared on the horizon. Nathan's skepticism wavered as the sound grew louder, the light brighter. The train emerged from the darkness, its black engine gleaming as if freshly polished. Steam hissed from its wheels and the whistle screamed, a sound that made Nathan's hair stand on end. The carriages were unlike anything he'd seen before, ornate and glowing faintly, as though they were made of glass. Nathan raised his camera, snapping photos as the train slowed to a stop in front of him. The doors of the nearest carriage slid open with a hiss, revealing nothing but darkness inside. A voice called from the shadows, low and melodic. "All aboard." Against his better judgment, Nathan stepped onto the train, the door closing behind him. The interior was opulent, with velvet seats and chandeliers that flickered dimly. But the air was heavy, and the windows revealed nothing but an endless void. As he moved through the carriages, Nathan saw them. The passengers. They sat motionless, their faces pale and their eyes hollow. Some wore clothes from decades past, others from eras Nathan couldn't place. One of them turned to look at him, its voice a raspy whisper. "Why are you here?" Nathan's breath caught. I wanted to see if the legend was true." The passenger smiled, a grotesque, unsettling expression. "It is." The train lurched forward, and Nathan stumbled into the next carriage. There, he found the conductor, a tall figure in a tattered uniform. Its face was obscured by shadows, but its voice was deep and commanding. "You shouldn't have boarded," the conductor said. "This train only takes one-way passengers." "I don't understand," Nathan said, his voice trembling. "What is this place?" "The ghost train collects souls," the conductor replied. "Lost, forgotten, or those who tempt fate like you. Nathan's heart raced. I'm not staying. Let me off. The conductor tilted its head. If you wish to leave, you must find the whistle. But beware. The train does not forgive trespassers. Nathan raced through the carriages, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The passengers' heads turned to watch him, their hollow eyes following his every move. The whispers grew louder, forming an eerie chant. Stay with us. Stay forever. In the engine room, he found it, a golden whistle resting on a pedestal. As he reached for it, a shadowy figure materialized, blocking his path. Its form shifted and writhed, and its voice was a guttural growl. You cannot leave, it said. Nathan grabbed the whistle and blew with all his strength. A piercing sound filled the train, drowning out the whispers. The shadows recoiled, and the train began to shake violently. Nathan woke up on the platform. The ghost train gone, and the station silent once more. His camera was still clutched in his hand, but the photos showed nothing, just an empty track. Shaken, he left Hollow Creek, vowing never to return. But at night, he still heard the train's whistle in his dreams, calling him back to the place where shadows whispered and the dead rode forever. End of Story 4, Story 5. The posters appeared overnight, plastered to lampposts and fences all over town. One night only, the Forgotten Carnival, an experience beyond your imagination. The location was an empty field at the edge of town, a place long abandoned. For Jake and his friends, the mystery was too intriguing to resist. It's probably just some indie art thing, Jake said, grinning as he pocketed one of the flyers. Could be fun. The others weren't so sure, but curiosity won out. At 10 p.m. sharp, they piled into Jake's car and drove toward the field. As they approached, the faint sound of carnival music drifted through the air. The field was transformed. Bright lights flickered against the night sky, illuminating colorful tents and towering rides. The scent of popcorn and roasted peanuts wafted through the air, and carnival barkers called out to invisible crowds. This is incredible, Jake said as they stepped out of the car. But something felt wrong. The carnival looked pristine, but there were no other visitors. A man in a top hat appeared, his grin impossibly wide. Welcome, friends, he said with a deep bow. The night is young, and the wonders are endless. Enjoy yourselves, but beware. Every choice has a price. The group wandered through the carnival, marveling at the strange attractions. Each game seemed tailored to their fears and desires. Jake tried a shooting gallery where the targets looked disturbingly lifelike. His best friend, Mia, was drawn to a fortune teller who spoke in riddles and knew secrets she couldn't possibly know. These prizes are worth more than gold, the barker said, as Jake won a strange, glowing orb. What do you mean? Jake asked, but the barker only smiled. As the group regrouped near the Ferris wheel, a piercing scream cut through the air. They turned to see a shadowy figure dragging one of the carnival staff into a dark tent. When they tried to follow, the entrance was gone, replaced by an empty patch of grass. Mia was the first to notice that their friend Eric was missing. He had been standing right next to her moments ago. The group split up to search for him, but the carnival seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting into a maze of glowing lights and shadowed corners. Jake found Eric's jacket near the carousel. It was torn and stained with something dark. The ride creaked to life, spinning faster and faster. As Jake backed away, he saw faces in the mirrors on the carousel, faces that weren't his. "We have to leave," Mia said when they regrouped. "This place isn't normal." The carnival's cheerful facade began to crumble. The lights flickered and the once lively music slowed to a haunting wail. Shadowy figures emerged, their hollow eyes fixed on the group. The man in the top hat appeared again, blocking their path to the exit. "Leaving so soon?" he asked. "What did you do to Eric?" Jake demanded. The man's grin widened. "He made his choice, as will you." A path opened before them, leading to a darkened tent. "If you wish to leave, enter, but beware. What lies ahead is not for the faint of heart." Inside the tent was a massive mirror, its surface rippling like water. The man in the top hat appeared behind them. "Step through," he said. "Face the truth, and you may yet be free." One by one, they stepped into the mirror. Each was confronted by their worst fears, played out in vivid detail. Jake saw himself alone, his friends' faces distorted and accusing. Mia was surrounded by whispers of secrets she thought long buried. Only when they accepted their fears did the mirror release them. They stumbled out of the tent into the cold night air. The carnival was gone, replaced by the empty field. As they drove away, Jake noticed the glowing orb he had once sitting on the dashboard. When he picked it up, a voice whispered from inside, "You escaped, but you're never truly free." The next morning, the posters were gone, and the field was empty. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the carnival was waiting for the next group to arrive. End of Story 5. Story 6, Blackwater Lake, was a hidden gem, nestled deep in the forest. Its waters were dark and still, reflecting the trees and sky like a perfect mirror. The locals, however, avoided it. They whispered about the lake's strange history, how people would go missing near its shores, their belongings found washed up days later. When Emma and her friends decided to camp by Blackwater, they dismissed the rumors as small-town superstitions. Emma was a skeptic, always chasing the thrill of the unexplained to prove it false. This lake was just another mystery waiting to be debunked. As they set up camp under the setting sun, the lake seemed almost peaceful. The water shimmered in the fading light, and the only sound was the gentle rustling of the wind through the trees. That night, as the group sat around the campfire, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual chirps and rustles of nocturnal animals conspicuously absent. "It's just the quiet you get in places like this," her friend Mark said, poking at the fire. "Nothing to worry about." But when Emma glanced toward the lake, she thought she saw ripples on its surface, though the air was still. A chill ran down her spine, and she decided to ignore it. That night, as she lay in her tent, she dreamt of being underwater. Something moved beneath her, circling, watching. When she woke up, her sleeping bag was damp, and the scent of algae clung to her skin. The next morning, Emma and Mark decided to explore the lake's shoreline. They found strange markings etched into the rocks near the water, symbols that looked ancient, almost ritualistic. "This is weird," Mark muttered, running his fingers over the grooves. As they examined the symbols, Emma noticed something beneath the surface of the water. It was faint, but she could see shapes moving slowly, deliberately. When she pointed it out, Mark squinted at the lake. "Probably fish," he said, though his voice lacked confidence. By the time they returned to camp, the others were gone. Their tents were still there, their belongings untouched, but there was no sign of them. The lake was eerily calm, its surface like glass. As dusk fell, Emma and Mark tried to call for help, but their phones had no signal. The fire they built barely seemed to warm them, and the lake's stillness felt oppressive. Then they heard it, a low hum, almost like a song, rising from the water. Shapes began to appear beneath the surface, dark and shifting. One by one, the figures emerged, their forms humanoid but wrong, their limbs too long, their eyes glowing faintly. "What the hell is that?" Mark whispered, his voice trembling. The figures didn't move toward the shore. They simply stood in the water, watching, panicking. Emma grabbed a flashlight and shone it on the lake. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing more of the figures. Their faces were blank, their mouths opening and closing as if trying to speak. "We need to leave," Mark said, pulling at her arm. But as they turned, the forest path seemed to stretch endlessly. No matter how far they ran, they always ended up back at the lake. The hum grew louder, filling their ears and making it hard to think. That night, Emma dreamt again. This time, she was underwater, surrounded by the figures. They reached for her, their cold hands pulling her down. When she woke, Mark was gone, his shoes still by the fire. Emma stood at the edge of the lake, the dark water lapping at her boots. The hum had stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence. The figures stood in the water, their eyes fixed on her. A voice whispered, not aloud, but in her mind, "Join us." Tears streamed down her face as she backed away. But the shoreline seemed to shrink, the lake's edge creeping closer with every step. She looked down and saw her reflection in the water, but it wasn't hers. The face staring back at her was hollow-eyed, her mouth moving soundlessly. With no other choice, Emma stepped into the water. The cold enveloped her and the figures closed in, their hands pulling her down. As the surface disappeared above her, she felt a strange calm. The lake had claimed her, just as it had the others. Weeks later, hikers found the abandoned campsite. The tents were intact, the belongings untouched, but there was no sign of Emma, Mark, or their friends. Locals added their names to the growing list of those lost to Blackwater Lake. On quiet nights, they say you can still hear the hum rising from the water, and if you look closely, you might see figures standing beneath the surface, waiting for the next visitor to join them. End of Story 6. Story 7. Amelia loved exploring antique shops. The dusty shelves and forgotten trinkets always held a certain magic, as if each item had its own story. It was on one such trip that she found the clock. The shop was dimly lit, with the faint scent of aged wood and mothballs. The clock stood on a pedestal in the center of the room, its brass frame gleaming despite the dust that covered everything else. Its face was intricate, with Roman numerals and 3 hands, but instead of ticking, it was silent. "How much for the clock?" Amelia asked the shopkeeper, an elderly man with sharp eyes and a cautious demeanor. He hesitated. "That clock isn't for sale." "Why not?" "It's cursed," he said simply. "Best leave it be." But Amelia didn't believe in curses. She was charmed by its craftsmanship and convinced the shopkeeper to sell it to her. As she carried the clock home, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was heavier than it should be, as though something unseen weighed it down. Amelia placed the clock on her mantel, admiring how it added a touch of elegance to her small apartment. That night she wound it up, watching as the hands began to move. The ticking was soft but steady, a soothing rhythm that lulled her to sleep. At exactly midnight, she woke to the sound of the clock chime. It was a deep, resonant tone that filled the room, though she hadn't noticed any mechanism for chiming. As she sat up, she realized something was wrong. The shadows in the room seemed alive, shifting and stretching unnaturally. And then she saw it. A figure standing in the corner, barely visible, but unmistakably there. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. When the clock chimed again, the figure vanished. The next morning, Amelia tried to dismiss the experience as a vivid dream. But as she examined the clock, she noticed an inscription on its base that she hadn't seen before. Time is a gift, but not without cost. She returned to the antique shop to confront the shopkeeper, but the store was closed. A handwritten note on the door read, "Closed indefinitely." Frustrated but undeterred, she decided to research the clock online. What she found sent chills down her spine. The clock was known as the Tempus Machina, a creation of a 19th century clockmaker who disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Legend had it that the clock could manipulate time, but at a terrible price. Those who owned it would see their lives unravel 1 hour at a time. That night, Amelia tried not to think about the clock, but its ticking seemed louder than before. As the hands reached midnight, she braced herself for the chime. When it came, the same deep tone resonated through the room, and the shadows returned. This time, the figure wasn't in the corner. It was closer, standing at the foot of her bed. Its features were still obscured, but she could feel its gaze, cold and unrelenting. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure raised a hand and pointed to the clock. The ticking stopped, and the room was plunged into silence. When she looked back, the figure was gone, but the clock's hands had moved backward by 1 hour. Over the next few days, Amelia's life began to change. Time became unpredictable. Some moments stretched endlessly, while others passed in a blink. She would lose hours, finding herself in places she didn't remember going, doing things she couldn't recall. The clock's chimes grew louder each night, and the shadowy figure came closer. By the 5th night, it was standing right beside her bed, its hand outstretched as if reaching for her. Desperate, she tried to destroy the clock. She threw it against the wall, but it didn't even scratch. She tried smashing it with a hammer, but the hammer broke instead. The clock continued to tick, its hands moving ever closer to midnight. On the 7th night, Amelia knew she couldn't escape. As the clock struck midnight, the chime echoed like a death knell. The figure appeared again, now fully formed. Its face was pale and gaunt, its eyes empty voids. "Time is up," it said, its voice hollow. Amelia felt a cold hand on her shoulder, and the world around her dissolved into darkness. When she opened her eyes, she was standing in a workshop filled with clocks, all ticking in unison. The figure was gone, but she could feel its presence. In front of her stood the Tempus Machina, its hands reset to 12. She realized, with a sinking dread, that she was now part of the clock's curse, its new keeper, bound to it for eternity. Weeks later, the Tempus Machina reappeared in the window of a different antique shop, gleaming enticingly. A young man stopped to admire it, drawn to its intricate design. As he stepped inside, the clock's ticking seemed to quicken, as if anticipating its next victim. End of Story 7. Story 8, when Lydia's Aunt Miriam passed away. She left behind a sprawling estate filled with priceless antiques and oddities. Among them was a portrait that hung in the main hallway. The painting depicted a woman in Victorian dress, her dark eyes following anyone who walked by. Lydia had always hated it as a child, but now, as the new owner of the house, she couldn't avoid it. The lawyer had given her clear instructions. The house and everything in it were hers, as long as she didn't remove or destroy the portrait. Lydia laughed at the absurdity of the condition, but agreed. After all, it was just a painting. The first night in the house, she felt a chill whenever she passed the portrait. It was as if the woman in the painting were watching her, judging her. Lydia tried to ignore the portrait, focusing instead on sorting through her aunt's belongings. But as she worked late into the night, she thought she heard something, a faint whisper. At first, she chalked it up to the creaking of the old house. But the whispers grew louder. They seemed to come from the hallway where the portrait hung. Steeling herself, Lydia stepped into the hall, flashlight in hand. "Is someone there?" she called out. The portrait was still, its painted eyes fixed on her. Yet the air felt charged, as if something unseen was lingering just out of reach. She swore she heard it then, a soft, raspy voice. "Lydia?" Determined to uncover the truth, Lydia began exploring the house more thoroughly. In the attic, she found an old diary belonging to her aunt. The entries were cryptic, filled with references to the Watcher and warnings never to disturb her place. "It's in the walls." One entry read, "She keeps the house safe, but only if you obey." Curiosity led Lydia to a locked door on the second floor. The key, found hidden in the attic, fit perfectly. Inside was a small room, bare except for a single chair facing a mirror. The walls were covered in writing, scrawled in what looked like soot. "She sees all. She knows all. Do not displease her." That night, Lydia couldn't sleep. She felt the weight of the portrait's gaze, even from her bedroom. When she finally drifted off, she dreamed of the woman in the painting, her dark eyes glowing as she stepped out of the frame. Lydia woke with a start, her heart pounding. Gathering her courage, she went to the hallway. The portrait seemed unchanged, until she noticed the eyes. They weren't painted anymore. They were real, glinting faintly in the dim light. She stumbled back, her breath catching. The whisper returned louder this time. "Why do you disturb me?" The next day, Lydia found more entries in the diary. Her aunt had made a bargain with the woman in the portrait. The painting was a prison, holding the spirit of a vengeful soul who had once lived in the house. In exchange for wealth and protection, her aunt had promised never to remove the portrait and to keep the house intact. Lydia felt trapped. She couldn't live with the portrait, but she feared what might happen if she disobeyed the warning. That night, she confronted the painting. "What do you want?" she demanded. The whisper came again, the voice cold and sharp. "Let me out." Desperate to end the torment, Lydia decided to destroy the portrait. She took a knife and slashed at the canvas. As the blade tore through the image, a deafening scream filled the house. The walls trembled and the lights flickered. The woman in the painting stepped out, her form twisting and shadowy. Her eyes burned with rage as she advanced on Lydia. "You broke the pact," she hissed. Lydia tried to run, but the house itself seemed to work against her. Doors slammed shut and shadows reached for her. The last thing she saw was the woman's outstretched hand. When Lydia's friends came looking for her days later, they found the house empty. The portrait was back on the wall, but the woman's face had changed. Her eyes now held a flicker of familiarity, a resemblance to Lydia. And at night, the whispers began again. Story 9. Late one evening, a mysterious envelope arrived at Sarah's door. It was sealed with wax and embossed with intricate patterns, unlike any invitation she'd ever seen. Inside was a card that read, "You are cordially invited to the Midnight Carnival, a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Follow the music at dusk." There was no address, only a small map that led to a field on the outskirts of town. Sarah couldn't resist the allure of something so peculiar. The next evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she set off, the sound of faint, otherworldly music guiding her. When she arrived, the field was alive with light and sound. Glittering rides towered over vibrant tents, and the smell of spun sugar and popcorn filled the air. It was a carnival like no other. And yet, something about it felt off. As Sarah walked through the carnival, she marveled at the strange attractions. There was a fortune teller who spoke in riddles, a hall of mirrors that seemed endless, and a Ferris wheel that reached far into the starry sky. But what struck her most was the people. The performers were unlike anyone she'd ever seen. Their faces painted in vibrant, unsettling patterns, their smiles too wide. The other guests moved through the carnival in a daze, their eyes glazed over as if in a trance. A man in a crimson coat and top hat approached her. "Welcome," he said, bowing low. "The night is yours to explore. But remember, every ride comes with a cost." Before she could ask what he meant, he vanished into the crowd. Sarah's first stop was the Hall of Mirrors. The entrance was lined with flickering lanterns, and a faint mist clung to the ground. Inside, the air was cold, and the walls reflected her image 1,000 times over. But as she ventured deeper, the reflections began to change. One by one, the mirrors showed versions of her life, her happiest moments, her darkest secrets. In one, she saw herself as a child, playing with her late grandmother. In another, she saw a shadowy figure standing behind her. When she turned around, there was no one there. A voice whispered from the depths of the maze, "Do you like what you see?" Sarah ran, her reflection laughing silently as she fled. When she finally stumbled out into the open air, the carnival seemed quieter, as if it were waiting for her next move. Shaken but intrigued, Sarah entered the fortune teller's tent. The air inside was heavy with incense, and a woman with piercing green eyes sat behind a table draped in velvet. A crystal ball glowed faintly between them. "You seek answers," the fortune teller said without looking up, "but the answers will cost you." "Cost me what?" Sarah asked. The fortune teller smiled, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp. "A piece of yourself." As Sarah hesitated, the crystal ball clouded over, revealing an image of her standing alone in the carnival. Around her, the lights dimmed and the performers closed in. The vision faded, and the fortune teller leaned forward. "The carnival takes what it's owed," she said. "Choose wisely." Determined to understand the carnival's secret, Sarah decided to ride the Ferris wheel. The operator, a tall figure with empty eyes, gestured for her to climb into the carriage. As the wheel began to turn, the lights of the carnival faded, replaced by an endless black void. From the darkness, voices called out to her, "Help us! Don't look down!" When Sarah glanced over the edge, she saw hundreds of faces staring up at her from the void, their mouths open in silent screams. The wheel turned faster, and the faces began to blur, merging into one massive, shadowy form. When the ride finally stopped, Sarah found herself back at the entrance of the carnival. But something was different. The vibrant colors had dulled, and the music was warped, almost sinister. The man in the crimson coat appeared again. "You've seen what lies beneath," he said. "Now you must choose. Stay and join us, or leave, but lose a part of yourself forever." "What are you?" Sarah demanded. "We are the Forgotten," he said, his grin widening. "Those who came before and couldn't leave. The carnival keeps us, just as it will keep you." Sarah refused to stay. She turned and ran, the ground beneath her feet shifting like quicksand. The performers reached for her, their faces twisted and monstrous. Just as they closed in, she saw a faint light in the distance, the headlights of her car. Summoning all her strength, she sprinted toward the light. The moment she crossed the threshold of the field, the carnival vanished. She collapsed beside her car, the sound of her heartbeat drowning out the silence. Days later, Sarah tried to tell her story, but no one believed her. When she returned to the field, it was empty, with no sign that the carnival had ever been there. But one night, she found another envelope on her doorstep. This time, the card read, "The Midnight Carnival returns soon. We'll be waiting."